You need to leave. You're not allowed in here anymore.
It was over 100 degrees outside. I had just driven 2 hours home. My shirt was stuck to my back with sweat, and this kid was blocking the gate to my own community pool.
Mom already decided. You're banned.
I looked at him. The homemade security shirt, printed at a copy shop, I would later find out, wrinkled at the collar, Ray-Bans sitting crooked on his face, arms crossed like he was auditioning for something. Behind him, the water was blue-green and still in the afternoon sun. I could hear kids laughing somewhere on the other side of that gate. No meeting, no paperwork, no explanation of any kind. Just the HOA president's son, 23 years old, never paid his own rent a day in his life, standing between me and something I had been paying dues on for 14 years. Angry? Yeah, but I didn't say a word, because he didn't know my name. Didn't know that I had spent 22 years working in this county. Didn't know that the man he just put his hand on was the former sheriff of Caldwell County. He just made the biggest mistake of his life. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Drop it in the comments. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Let me back up and give you the full picture, because you need to understand what Sycamore Ridge was before it became a war zone. Sycamore Ridge is a 64-home planned community in a mid-sized county in North Carolina. The kind of place where the houses are brick-fronted, the lawns are edged like someone uses a ruler, and the HOA has existed since 1987. Every summer evening from May through September, you could smell someone's charcoal grill drifting through the whole neighborhood. You could hear a porch swing creaking 3 houses down, the kind of place you move to when you want to put down real roots. I moved in 14 years ago. My name is Garrett Winslow. 22 years in law enforcement, the last 6 as the elected sheriff of Caldwell County. I bought my house the old-fashioned way. Worked, saved, kept my hands off my retirement account until I had to. The community pool is part of what sold my wife, Darlene, on the place. She grew up in Phoenix. She takes pools seriously. For over a decade, Sycamore Ridge was genuinely good. The HOA threw cookouts every July. We ran a neighborhood watch I helped set up. Fence line disputes got settled with handshakes. The board was made up of reasonable people who understood that running an HOA doesn't mean running a fiefdom. Then Merrill Calloway ran for HOA president. Merrill is somewhere in her mid-50s, always in pressed khaki capris, always carrying a clipboard like it's a scepter. She moved into the neighborhood about 5 years ago, and within 18 months, she had worked her way onto the board by showing up to every single meeting and objecting to everything until the people who actually had lives gave up and went home. She won the presidency by default. She simply outlasted the exhausted. Her style of enforcement was what you might generously call selective. Families she liked, mostly the newer, wealthier arrivals, got gentle reminder notices. Families she didn't like, older residents, working families, a few people who had simply annoyed her once, got formal violations, fines, and in at least 2 cases, threats of lien. She had a gift for digging up rules from the covenants that hadn't been enforced in 30 years and weaponizing them against specific people. She also, and I say this with the precision of someone who spent 2 decades reading people for a living, deeply enjoyed the theater of power. She didn't just want things done her way. She wanted you to feel smaller for having disagreed with her. Her son Bryce had moved back home after a short and unsuccessful run at making it somewhere. Nashville, maybe Charlotte, the story kept changing. He'd been back about 4 months when Merrill appointed him as the HOA's community safety coordinator. She invented that title. It wasn't in any bylaw. She just typed it on a laminated badge and handed it to her kid. And apparently, that was that. That's the world I came home to after a golf weekend with 2 old department colleagues, sunburned across the back of my neck, carrying a gas station deli bag that smelled like a microwave burrito had done something morally wrong. Darlene had texted me 3 times while I was driving. All 3 were variations of, "You need to see what's happening at the pool." I pulled in the driveway, grabbed my bag, and I walked toward the pool gate to find out exactly what that meant. The community pool at Sycamore Ridge sits behind a wrought iron fence at the center of the neighborhood. You can see it from the main road, that shimmer of blue-green water catching the afternoon light. About 40 by 20 feet, surrounded by concrete decking that always smells like chlorine and sunscreen in equal measure. There's a small bathhouse, a row of plastic loungers, and a laminated rules sign that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. When I got there, 7 or 8 residents were standing outside the gate. Inside, sitting in a plastic chair he dragged out from the bathhouse, was Bryce Calloway. He had that security shirt on, a clipboard balanced on one knee, and the look on his face of someone who had recently acquired a small amount of authority and was finding it very exciting. "Pool is under new access protocols," he said, not standing up. "Residents need to show their HOA ID card before entry." I blinked. "The pool has been open to all residents for 30 years. There are no ID cards." "There will be," he tapped the clipboard. "Mom, President Calloway, is rolling out a new guest verification system. Starting today, we're in a soft launch phase." Soft launch. He actually said soft launch, about a neighborhood pool. Around me, I could hear the murmur of neighbors. Hilda Bro, in her 70s, had been swimming laps at this pool for 15 years, was standing with her towel rolled under her arm, looking confused and a little hurt. Danny Rourke, 3 kids under 10, was behind her with a bag full of pool toys and an expression that said he was calculating exactly how much trouble it was worth to make. I looked at Bryce. "Who authorized this?" "The HOA president has authority over community amenities under—" "I know the covenants," I said. "I've been in this neighborhood longer than you've lived in this state. The board can regulate pool hours and safety rules. They cannot restrict access to dues-paying residents without a full board vote." He finally stood up. He had 3 inches on me in height and was using all of them. "Sir, I'm going to need you to either produce your ID or step back from the gate." "Sir." I had badge numbers memorized that were older than this kid. I didn't pull a badge. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "I'll be calling the county attorney's office Monday morning to ask about the enforceability of this policy. In the meantime, I'd like to see whatever written authority you have for this action." He blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. I could see him calculating, push harder or back down. He chose a third option. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. While he did that, I turned to Hilda and said quietly, "Go on in, Hilda." She looked at me, then at Bryce, with his back half turned. She walked through the gate. Danny Rourke followed with his 3 kids. Bryce spun around. "Hey, I didn't authorize. They're dues-paying residents," I said. "You have no legal authority to physically bar them from this amenity. If you put your hands on any of them, we're having a very different conversation." He stared at me. I stared back. 22 years of staring at people who didn't want to back down had given me a particular kind of patience in moments like these. He didn't touch anyone. He went back to his phone call. I went home, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. First thing I did was pull up the Sycamore Ridge CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern the HOA, and read them the same way I used to read search warrant applications. Second thing I did was open a notes document. I labeled it Pool Incident Number 1. I had a feeling it wasn't going to be the last entry. 2 days later, printed notices showed up on every mailbox in the neighborhood. I found mine Tuesday morning when I went out for the paper, a cream-colored sheet in a plastic sleeve, bearing the official-looking Sycamore Ridge HOA letterhead that Meryl had apparently designed herself. The font was Impact. Make of that what you will. The notice announced the new community pool access policy. Effective immediately, residents were required to pre-register up to 2 household members for pool access. Additional household members, meaning children, would require written requests submitted to the HOA board at least 5 business days in advance. Guests were prohibited entirely until further notice, pending a security assessment. Security assessment. For a suburban pool with a broken diving board and a storage shed full of foam noodles. I read it 3 times. Then I brought it inside, scanned it, and saved it to a folder I'd already started labeling by date. Old habits. My neighbor across the street, an Army veteran named Cornelius Fitch, tall man, quiet, the kind of person who fixes other people's fence posts without being asked, knocked on my door that afternoon. He was holding his notice like it had personally offended him, which it had. "Garrett," he said, "Meryl has been to my door twice this year. Once because my truck was in the driveway too many consecutive days. Once because she said my mailbox post was 2 inches off center." He held up 2 fingers. 2 inches. Now this. "I know," I said. "She's never gone to the Harrington Sloans about their peeling porch paint. Never cited the Webbers about their Christmas lights being up until March." I knew that too. The enforcement pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. Meryl's rules bent around her favorites and hardened against everyone else. Cornelius was one of 3 black homeowners in Sycamore Ridge. He'd been cited 4 times in 2 years. The Harrington Sloanes hadn't been cited once. That pattern wasn't just frustrating. That pattern had a name in housing law, and it wasn't a pretty one. I asked Cornelius if he'd kept his violation notices. He had, filed in a folder in his home office, because he'd also been around long enough to know that paperwork matters. I asked if the other cited residents might be willing to talk. He said he'd make some calls. Meanwhile, I reached out to a friend from my law enforcement days, a woman named Priscilla Hargrove, who had spent the last decade as a civil rights attorney in Raleigh. We'd worked a case together 15 years ago, the kind that sticks with you. I laid out the whole situation: selective enforcement, the pool access policy, the pattern across residents. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me everything you have." I also did something that sounds almost comically simple, but turned out to matter enormously. I went to the county recorder's office and pulled the public records on every HOA fine and violation issued by Sycamore Ridge HOA over the past 4 years. Public record. Anyone can pull it. Most people don't know to. Takeaway. HOA enforcement records are often public documents at the county level. File a records request and you might be surprised what patterns show up. What I found was a spreadsheet's worth of confirmation. 41 violations issued in 4 years. 33 of them had gone to 9 specific households. 7 of those 9 had voted against Meryl's original election or spoken against her at a board meeting. The remaining 2 included Cornelius. The smell of something rotten was getting harder to ignore. On Thursday of that same week, Bryce set up what I can only describe as a checkpoint at the pool gate: a folding table, a sign-in sheet, and a cheap webcam plugged into a laptop recording everyone who entered. He'd also installed, or had installed, a ring-style camera above the gate that wasn't pointed at the gate itself, but angled outward toward the street and the surrounding homes. That camera angle was a mistake. Not his first, not his last. Meryl's next move was to come at me directly. I almost respected it. Bold, at least. Wrong, but bold. The citation arrived by certified mail on a Friday afternoon. It accused me of inciting unauthorized pool access on the day of Bryce's soft launch enforcement and levied a $250 fine. It also included a warning that repeated violations could result in suspension of community amenity access for up to 90 days. She had attached a grainy screenshot from the gate camera. Me, standing at the pool entrance, talking to Hilda. My face was circled in red, digitally. She had circled my face with a digital red marker on a printed screenshot and then mailed it to me by certified letter. I set it on my kitchen counter next to my coffee mug and stared at it for a long moment. Darlene came in, looked at it, looked at me, and said, "She circled your face." "She circled my face," I confirmed. "Garrett." She poured herself a coffee. "End her." That's not how I operate, but I understood the sentiment. I called Priscilla that evening. She'd been reviewing what I sent and had an update. The selective enforcement pattern was potentially actionable under the Fair Housing Act, if we could establish that the enforcement decisions correlated with protected class status. We weren't there yet, but we were building toward it. She also flagged something I hadn't caught. Meryl's citation had a procedural problem. Under the Sycamore Ridge CC and RS, fines required a written warning first, a notice of violation, a 14-day cure period, and then a hearing opportunity before the board. She had skipped every single one of those steps. The fine was, in a strict reading of their own documents, invalid. Takeaway: HOA fines are only enforceable if they follow the exact procedural steps laid out in your community's governing documents. Skip one step, and the fine may be legally void. I sent a formal written response disputing the fine on procedural grounds and requesting a board hearing, which was my right under the CC and RS. I CC'd Priscilla, listed her as my legal representative, and noted that all further communication should go through her office. The tone was courteous, precise, and I imagine very annoying to receive. What I still hadn't revealed: my job title. I'd retired from the sheriff's office 2 years earlier and moved into a county consulting role, but I still held an elected seat on a county oversight board. More to the point, I still had the kind of relationships with the active sheriff's department and the county attorney's office that you build over 2 decades of showing up, doing the work, and not being a coward when it counted. I was letting Meryl run. I wanted the full pattern established before I pulled back the curtain. The camera above the pool gate turned out to be the thread that started unraveling everything. My neighbor Theodore Vaughn, retired electrical engineer, the kind of man who solves problems the same way a surgeon operates, walked over one morning with his coffee and stood next to me studying the angle. "That camera," Theo said, "is pointed at your driveway." He was right. If you drew a line from the lens to its field of view, it captured roughly 40% of my front property, including my vehicle and my front door. "That's a privacy issue," I said. "That's a tort," he replied, and sipped his coffee like he'd just commented on the weather. Theo was right again. Installing a camera that captures footage of a neighboring private property without consent creates potential liability under North Carolina's privacy statutes. It's also a violation of Sycamore Ridge's own community guidelines, which prohibited surveillance equipment directed at private residences. Meryl had been using her own community rules against residents for years. She had apparently never actually read them herself. I photographed the camera angle, documented it with timestamps, added it to the folder, which was getting substantial by now. That weekend on the community Facebook group, Bryce posted a message, approved by his mother no doubt, accusing unnamed residents of organizing against the HOA board, and warning that legal action was being considered against those who disrupted community operations. He used the phrase hostile actors to describe his neighbors who owned their homes, paid their dues, some of whom had been there since before he was born. The comments section was something to behold. Hilda Bro, 73 years old, replied with 9 words. "I have lived here for 18 years, young man." That comment got 47 likes, which in a 64-home neighborhood is basically unanimous. The thing about paper trails is they go both ways. I'd been carefully building mine, but it turned out Meryl had left her own. She just never expected anyone to follow it back. Priscilla's paralegal, a sharp young woman doing the kind of background work that makes or breaks cases, ran a routine financial search on the HOA entity and found something that stopped the whole conversation cold. Sycamore Ridge HOA was in debt. Not casual rainy day deficit debt, significant structural debt. The HOA had borrowed $47,000 3 years ago against the community's reserve fund, the pool maintenance account, the road repair fund, the shared infrastructure reserve, ostensibly to cover community improvements. The loan was through a private lender rather than a standard HOA financial institution, which was immediately unusual. The borrower on the loan documents was listed as Sycamore Ridge HOA, signed by the president at the time of execution. Meryl had been president for 3.5 years. The community improvements the money was supposed to fund? When Priscilla's team compared the loan timeline to actual maintenance records, obtained through a North Carolina public records request on the HOA's state filings, the improvements didn't line up. The pool got a basic resurfacing that cost maybe $8,000. The rest of the spending was categorized in HOA meeting minutes as administrative and operational costs. Administrative and operational costs totaling $39,000. In a community where the HOA president position is legally volunteer and unpaid. Takeaway: HOA finances are often required to be disclosed to members upon request. In most states, you have a legal right to inspect HOA financial records. File a written request and see what you find. I want to be careful here. At this point, we had anomalies and unanswered questions, not proven wrongdoing. Priscilla was very clear about that. But we had enough to justify demanding a full financial audit at the next board meeting, which under the CC and Rs was also something any group of 10 or more residents could formally request by signed petition. Cornelius organized that petition in 3 days. He went door to door, didn't tell people why, just said he had reason to believe the HOA's finances deserved a closer look, and that he had legal support behind the request. He got signatures from 31 households, nearly half the community, in 72 hours. That's what happens when a neighborhood has been quietly simmering for years, and someone finally gives them a legal, procedural outlet. When Meryl received the petition, hand-delivered to her front door by Cornelius, with the quiet dignity of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment, her response was to call an emergency board meeting for the following Saturday, and post a message on the community Facebook group calling the petition an organized attack by outside agitators. Outside agitators. These were her neighbors. They had watched her kid grow up. I wasn't showing my full hand yet, but the cards were arranged, the table was set, and I had a Monday morning appointment with someone who had the authority to make Meryl's entire weekend very complicated. Let me tell you how you dismantle a petty empire. You don't blow it up. You let it collapse under its own weight. But you make sure the right people are watching when it falls. The Monday appointment was with Harlan Pruitt, the county attorney, who had been my county attorney for 6 of my years as sheriff, and who had a very clear sense of both the law and which battles were actually worth fighting. I sat across from him in his office, that particular government building smell of old carpet and recycled air, and laid out the whole situation. The selective enforcement, the privacy camera, the procedurally void fine, the financial anomalies in the HOA accounts, and the fact that Bryce Calloway, acting under his mother's authority, had physically attempted to bar dues-paying residents from a community amenity. Harlan listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his pen and tapped it twice on his desk. "You retired," he said. "You didn't stop being you." "No," I said. I didn't. He agreed to have a deputy county attorney attend Saturday's board meeting in an official observer capacity. That was piece 1. Not intervention, just presence. The kind of presence that makes people very careful about what they say under their own governing documents. Piece 2 was Priscilla, who had by now formalized her involvement. She drafted 2 things: a formal demand letter citing the Fair Housing Act implications of the enforcement pattern, addressed to the HOA board and copied to the state's Human Relations Commission, and a notice of legal representation for Cornelius and 4 other residents who agreed to be named plaintiffs if things went further. The Fair Housing Act is a federal law. It prohibits discriminatory housing practices, including in HOA enforcement, based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. Enforcement patterns that disproportionately target protected classes, without legitimate non-discriminatory justification, can trigger federal liability. This was not a small thing to have sitting on a board president's doorstep. Takeaway: if your HOA's enforcement pattern seems to target residents based on protected characteristics, the Fair Housing Act is a legitimate legal avenue. Federal protections apply to HOA communities. Piece 3 was the financial audit demand. Priscilla's team had identified a North Carolina statute, GS 47F-3-118, for anyone who wants to look it up, that gives HOA members the right to inspect the association's financial records. The petition's 31 signatures triggered a mandatory response from the board. If they refused to provide the records, that refusal itself became a legal problem. Piece 4 was local media. I'd had a long professional relationship with the county's independent paper, the Caldwell Courier-Ledger, the kind of paper that still has a courthouse reporter who knows everybody by name. I made a quiet call. Not a tip, not a formal complaint, just a heads up that Saturday's board meeting might be worth covering. The reporter, a weathered woman named Odalis, who had covered local government for 23 years, knew a story when she smelled one. She said she'd send someone. Piece 5 was the most personally satisfying. Theo Vaughn had spent a week documenting the surveillance camera's field of view, measuring angles, photographing timestamps to prove it had been continuously capturing footage of my front property. He compiled it into a 12-page PDF with photographs and annotations that looked, and I mean this sincerely, like a federal evidence exhibit. Retired engineers are terrifying people to have on your side. Meanwhile, Bryce had been escalating in ways that were making everything easier. He'd started patrolling the neighborhood, walking the streets with his clipboard and phone camera at various hours, photographing residents' properties and vehicles. He left a note on Danny Rourke's mailbox claiming Danny's car violated new street rules. There were no new street rules. He confronted Hilda about the color of her garden hose. The garden hose was green. It had been green for 15 years. No rule addressed hose color. Every one of these encounters was being documented by residents themselves, who under Cornelius's quiet coordination had started keeping individual logs of their interactions with Bryce and Meryl. 22 separate residents, 22 logs. Saturday was 4 days away, and I had one card left I hadn't played. The one I'd been holding since this started, waiting for exactly the right moment. Nobody at the HOA knew I was the former sheriff of this county. My name wasn't on any badge or sign in the neighborhood. The consulting work I did was county level, not the kind of thing that made local news. To Merrill and Bryce, I had been just a neighbor who asked inconvenient questions. It was time to stop being just a neighbor. Merrill did not take the petition quietly. In the days before Saturday's meeting, she conducted what I can only describe as a smear operation, which would have been more effective if she were smarter about it. First, she went door to door herself, clipboard in hand, full pressed khaki capri energy, visiting households that had signed the petition and explaining that they'd been misled by misinformation, and that the petition was the work of a small group with a personal vendetta against the board. She asked them to withdraw their signatures. Several residents told me afterward that she had implied, without stating it directly, that signing could affect their relationship with the HOA going forward. That kind of implication has a legal definition. It's called coercion. Second, she posted a wall of text message on the community Facebook group. No paragraph breaks, pure grievance, accusing Cornelius Fitch by name of organizing illegal activity against the HOA. She didn't specify what the illegal activity was because there wasn't any, but she used the phrase twice. She also referred to outside legal interference being directed at the community's duly elected leadership. Priscilla, hearing this over the phone, made a sound I can only describe as quiet professional delight. Defaming a private citizen by name on a public forum while holding a position of authority over community resources. Add it to the folder. Third, and this is where it got genuinely ugly, Bryce showed up at Cornelius's door on a Thursday evening. I know exactly what happened because Cornelius told me immediately afterward, and because Cornelius has a doorbell camera that recorded the entire conversation. Bryce stood on Cornelius's front porch and told him, in so many words, that the HOA board was considering escalating enforcement action on several outstanding violations on his property. Violations that, as far as Cornelius knew, did not exist, and that it might be in everyone's interest if he stepped back from the petition business. He used the phrase, "things could get difficult." Things could get difficult, said by the son of the HOA president, on a doorbell camera, to a man whose case was already in the hands of a civil rights attorney. I want to be fair to the universe here. Sometimes people just hand you the rope. Cornelius thanked Bryce politely, closed the door, and immediately texted me. Got it on camera. I texted back. Forward it to Priscilla. That footage, clear, time-stamped, audio intact, was the kind of evidence that changes the scope of a legal matter from procedural dispute to potentially criminal. Intimidating a resident to withdraw from a legitimate legal proceeding has a name: witness tampering. It also has teeth. Merrill, sensing that things were starting to slip, made one more move. She called an emergency executive session, a closed-door meeting with just herself and the 2 board members she'd effectively appointed, and passed a resolution making the pool access policy permanent. She also quietly removed the financial records from the HOA's shared digital folder and changed the password. Removing financial records when a legal records request has already been filed, even an informal one, even before formal legal action, falls into a category attorneys call spoliation. It's a serious problem. It was, to use a technical term, a very stupid thing to do. I spent Friday evening on the phone with Priscilla. Saturday was 12 hours away. The county attorney's observer had confirmed. The Courier-Ledger had confirmed. Priscilla was bringing a colleague. 31 residents had their logs, their photos, and their documented experiences ready. And I had spent an hour that afternoon ironing a specific shirt, a blue one, with a gold shield pin on the chest that I'd worn every single day for 22 years and still kept in the top right drawer of my dresser. Merrill had been running this community like it was her personal property for 3.5 years. Tomorrow, she was going to find out who she'd been running it against. Saturday morning arrived with the particular clarity of a late summer Carolina day. The sky, that specific shade of blue you only get when the humidity has finally relented for 12 hours. The air carrying the faint smell of cut grass, and someone 2 streets over running a leaf blower. Darlene made coffee. I drank mine standing at the kitchen counter, already in the blue shirt, going over my notes one more time. The board meeting was set for 10 o'clock at the Sycamore Ridge Community Room, a beige rectangle attached to the pool building, Capacity maybe 50 people at a squeeze. Cornelius had quietly passed word that residents should attend. He hadn't said why, just that their presence mattered. By 9:30, 41 residents were gathered in the parking lot outside the community room. I'm not a man who gets sentimental easily, but something about seeing that many of your neighbors, people with coffee thermoses and folding chairs, Hilda in her Sunday blouse, Danny Rourke with all 3 kids, Theo carrying his 12-page PDF in a manila folder like it was a legal brief, does something to you. This wasn't a mob. This was a community. And a community is something I have spent my entire working life believing in. Inside, Meryl was already positioned at the head table with the 2 board members she'd effectively appointed, a pair of newer residents named Cassidy and Walsh, who had clearly not anticipated being accessories to anything, and were showing it in their body language. Bryce sat off to the side with his clipboard and his security shirt, which he'd apparently pressed, points for commitment to the bit. The county attorney's observer, a composed young woman named Bethany from Harlan's office, was already in the back row with a legal pad. The Courier-Ledger had sent not just a reporter, but a photographer. Priscilla was in the 3rd row, suited, perfectly still. Meryl saw none of this as a warning. That was her final and most complete mistake. She opened the meeting with a prepared statement. The petition was invalid. The community was being manipulated by outside forces, and anyone with concerns should submit them in writing for board review. 7 minutes, no questions. A performance designed to run out the clock and discourage participation. When she finished, I raised my hand. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of the contempt she usually kept better hidden. "Mr. Winslow." "President Calloway," I said, standing. "I have several agenda items I'd like to formally introduce under the resident participation portion of this meeting, as permitted under Article 6 of our bylaws." She opened her mouth. I kept going. First, a procedural challenge to the pool access policy adopted in executive session, which, under our governing documents, requires a full board vote with resident notice. Second, the financial audit request, signed by 31 households, which I'd like entered into the official meeting record. Third, a formal complaint regarding a surveillance camera installed above the pool gate in violation of community privacy guidelines. And fourth, "Mr. Winslow, this is not—" "And fourth," I said, not raising my voice, "a formal request for the board president to explain, on the record, the disposition of approximately $47,000 borrowed against the Community Reserve Fund over the past 3 years." The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has actual weight to it. Cassidy looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the floor. Neither of them said a word. Bryce stood up from his chair along the wall. "My mother has done nothing but serve this, sir." Bethany from the county attorney's office, not unkindly. "I'd recommend everyone take their seat. I'm here in an observer capacity, but I want to note for the record that this meeting is being documented by my office." Bryce sat down. And Meryl, who had spent 3.5 years treating this neighborhood like her personal experiment in small-stakes authoritarianism, looked at me with an expression that finally had some doubt in it. "Who are you?" she said, not rude, almost genuinely curious. I reached up and touched the gold pin on my chest. The room could see it. The photographer's camera made a soft click. "Garrett Winslow," I said, "former sheriff of Caldwell County, 14-year resident of this community, and the person who has spent the last 3 weeks documenting everything." There is a particular quality to a room when a person realizes they have miscalculated, not just tactically, but fundamentally, at the level of who they were actually dealing with. I have seen it across dozens of investigations, hundreds of confrontations, 22 years of professional situations, where someone suddenly understood that the position they thought they occupied was not the position they actually occupied. The body does something nobody can fully control. The shoulders drop. The chin comes up. The eyes go somewhere internal for just a second, calculating, recalculating. Meryl Calloway did all of that in about 4 seconds at the head of a folding table in a beige community room, while 41 of her neighbors watched. Then she tried to adjourn the meeting. "I'm calling a recess," she said. "This meeting is, Madam President." Priscilla was on her feet. Her voice was perfectly measured, not aggressive, just unarguably present. You are not permitted to adjourn a regular meeting during the resident participation period without a 2/3 board vote, per Article 6, Section 3 of the Sycamore Ridge bylaws. I have the document here if you'd like to reference it. She held up a tabbed copy of the CC and Rs. She had highlighted Section 3. Cassidy looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the floor. Neither of them voted to adjourn. The meeting continued. What happened over the next hour and 40 minutes was not a shouting match, and I want to be clear about that. No thrown chairs, no screaming. What it was, actually, was a very thorough community reckoning conducted in parliamentary order, with a legal observer present and a reporter taking notes. Cornelius presented the enforcement log. 22 residents, 73 documented incidents, dated and described. He read a selection of them aloud in his steady, unhurried voice. The room listened. Some people nodded. Some looked like they were hearing their own experiences, described out loud for the very first time. Theo presented the surveillance camera documentation. He had brought an actual printed photo of the camera angle, overlaid with a property line diagram. Bethany from the county attorney's office asked for a copy for her records. Theo produced an extra. He had brought extras. Priscilla formally introduced the Fair Housing Act complaint that had already been filed with the State Human Relations Commission, filed the previous Wednesday, before the meeting, before Merrill had any way to prepare for it. That document, she explained, would initiate an investigation that would subpoena the HOA's financial records directly if they were not voluntarily provided. Merrill had changed the password on the shared financial folder on Thursday. By Friday, the commission had been notified of the records access problem. Attempting to restrict access to financial records after receiving a records request, even an informal one, is something investigators call consciousness of guilt behavior. You didn't need a law degree to understand what it implied. Bryce said almost nothing for most of the meeting. At one point, he started to speak. I think he was going to say something about community safety, and Merrill put her hand on his arm and he stopped. Even she understood by then that there was nothing useful he could add. The mic drop moment, such as it was, came quietly. The Courier-Ledger photographer had been working the room throughout the meeting. At one point, she positioned herself to get a shot of me standing at the resident microphone. Blue shirt, gold pin, the folding table with Merrill visible behind me. I didn't know she was doing it until the paper ran the photo above the fold the following week, under the headline, Former County Sheriff Among Residents Challenging HOA President Over Finance, Access Concerns. But the moment that will stay with me happened before the meeting ended. Hilda Bro raised her hand and was recognized. She stood up slowly, with the dignity of a woman who has been in rooms that mattered for a long time. She looked at Merrill and said, I have lived in this neighborhood for 18 years. I have paid every assessment on time, attended every meeting when I was able, and asked for very little. I would like to swim in my community pool without my neighbor's son making me feel like a criminal. That is all I'm asking. 40 people in a beige room heard that. Nobody said a word for a full 5 seconds. Then Danny Rourke started a slow clap, and his 7-year-old daughter, who had been sitting in the back row with a foam pool noodle across her lap because she had apparently dressed for the occasion, joined in. Merrill Calloway did not clap. She stared at the table. The vote on the financial audit request passed. Cassidy and Walsh both voted yes. They had made their calculation, and it was probably the right one. The weeks that followed moved the way these things move when they've been handled correctly, steadily, procedurally, and without drama, because the drama had already happened. Merrill Calloway resigned as HOA president 11 days after the meeting. She sent a 2-sentence email to the board, stating she was stepping down for personal reasons. The financial audit, conducted by an independent CPA firm the new interim board hired, found significant irregularities in the administrative and operational costs spending, roughly $31,000 in expenditures that couldn't be traced to any documented community expense. The matter was referred to the county DA's office. I'll let the legal process handle the rest of that story, because that's how it should work. Bryce returned the laminated badge and the security shirt, as far as anyone knows. He was not seen at the pool gate again. The surveillance camera was removed within a week of the meeting, following a letter from Priscilla, citing both the community guidelines violation and potential civil liability. Theo Vaughn watched the removal from his front porch with his morning coffee. He told me afterward it was one of the most satisfying things he had witnessed in 30 years of living in the neighborhood. The pool access policy was formally rescinded by the new interim board in their first official session. Hilda Bro was present. She brought a casserole for the board members. That is precisely the kind of person she is. The fair housing complaint to the State Human Relations Commission remains under investigation. The enforcement pattern documented across 22 households is being reviewed. These things take time, and they should. Precision matters more than speed in situations like this. What happened to Sycamore Ridge in the months after? That's the part I want to make sure you hear. The new board, elected in a special election in October with 9 candidates for 3 seats, the most contested HOA election anyone could remember, established a community grievance process with a neutral third-party mediator. They commissioned an accessibility audit of community facilities and budgeted for sidewalk repairs that had been deferred for years. They created a resident advisory committee that meets quarterly. Cornelius Fitch was elected board president. He accepted on the condition that all board meetings would be recorded and that minutes would be publicly posted within 5 business days. Both conditions passed unanimously. And this past spring, the community voted to establish the Sycamore Ridge Neighborhood Scholarship Fund, seeded with the recovered funds from the HOA audit. It awards 2 $500 scholarships annually to graduating seniors from the local high school, whose families are residents of the neighborhood. The first 2 recipients were announced at the July 4th cookout, the best-attended community event in at least a decade. Someone brought a speaker. There were 3 different potato salads. I went. I ate the one with mustard, which is obviously the correct choice. I watched Hilda Bro do laps in the community pool, and I thought about what a neighborhood actually is. Not the houses, not the HOA rules, not the fence lines. It's the accumulated decision, made over and over again, to show up for the people you share a place with, to care about Hilda's 18 years the same way you care about Danny's kids' summers, to treat a community not like a property you manage, but like something you belong to. We almost let one woman's need for control hollow that out. We didn't.
You know what gets me about Gary's situation? She had that $250 fine certified and mailed before she even followed her own process. No written warning, no hearing. Just his face circled in red marker on a printed screenshot. And he didn't blow up, didn't show up at her door. He just opened the CCNRs and started reading. That's the part most people skip. I have seen this pattern before. Different state, different name, same assumption that nobody is going to sit down and actually learn the rules well enough to use them back. And most of the time, that assumption is right. Most people get the fight, get frustrated, pay it, and move on. Garrett didn't move on. 3 weeks of documentation before he walked into that meeting room. 3 weeks. If any part of this felt familiar to you, if you got your own version of this sitting in a drawer somewhere, tell me about it in the comments. I read them. And if this story is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from. Different neighborhood, different faces, but the same thing keeps showing up. See you on the next one.